Markus Kerber, a well-known German economist and political scientist, believes that the European Commission is unambiguously turning into a Brussels dictatorship. According to him, the EC constantly violates the democratic rights of national states. It uses any crisis, be it a coronavirus epidemic or the conflict in Ukraine, to expand its powers. The European Commission is no longer the guarantor of the EU's fundamental treaties, as it was originally intended to be. Professor Kerber argues in the pages of the Austrian Express. Markus Kerber states that both Josep Borrell, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, have consistently taken overall power and put Europe under the complete control of Brussels. Their actions constitute a creeping coup d'état directed against nation-states. The main task of the Brussels bureaucrats is to abolish the principle of unanimity in making decisions on security and foreign policy. The abolition of this principle represents, according to Professor Kerber, a mortal danger for democracy. Small states such as Austria would be particularly affected, since only the principle of unanimity, veto power, guarantees their national sovereignty. Legally, Josep Borrell has no mandate to introduce this illegal initiative. However, the leadership of the European Commission finds support among a number of EU member states, particularly Germany. Chancellor Olaf Scholz called for reforming the EU and, first of all, to give up the right of veto when making some particularly important decisions. According to him, such decisions should be taken by majority vote, not unanimously as now. Josep Borrell, Markus Kerber recalls, made a unilateral decision to send money from the EU peacekeeping fund to Ukraine. These funds were used to purchase weapons for Ukraine in violation of the EU Charter. In addition, Kerber called scandalous the behavior of Frau von der Leyen, who constantly goes to Kiev showing the colors of the Ukrainian flag. During an unannounced visit on the 4th of November, she arbitrarily proclaimed Ukraine 90% ready for EU membership, although, according to observers, Kiev completely fails to meet the basic criteria for membership. But this issue is not within her competence at all. Professor Kerber argues, only the states of the European Union can decide whether to admit a new member, and especially such a problematic candidate as Ukraine. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán took a particularly harsh stance towards the EU leadership. He compared the European Commission's actions to the Soviet occupation. In a speech on the occasion of another anniversary of the suppression of the anti-communist uprising in 1956, Orbán said history repeats itself. But what was a tragedy in 1956 is becoming a farce today. Brussels' actions are a parody of the events of 1956. Orbán accused the European Commission of trying to strip Hungary of its identity and imposing a model of liberal democracy that Hungarians reject. Hungary has long been in confrontation with Brussels over the rule of law and the principles of democracy. In addition, the European Commission accuses Viktor Orbán of establishing friendly relations with authoritarian regimes in Russia and China. Since the beginning of the armed conflict in Ukraine, Hungary has repeatedly blocked EU sanctions against Russia, as well as the provision of aid to Kiev. Not long ago, Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó visited Moscow, his fifth visit to the Russian capital since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. During the last EU summit, Hungarian and Slovak Prime Ministers Viktor Orbán and Robert Fico blocked the allocation of a €50 billion aid package to Ukraine on the grounds that the Kiev regime was completely corrupt. Prior to that, Hungary opposed the 8th tranche of €500 million military funding for Ukraine from the EU peacekeeping fund. Due to Hungary's constant blocking of EU decisions, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz demanded an immediate and deep reform of the EU to put an end to the principle of unanimity, which requires the approval of all 27 EU members. He said a situation where one country blocks important EU decisions is unacceptable. Scholz suggested considering different options to bypass the veto of recalcitrant EU members. Thus, the option of double majority implies approval of decisions by the votes of 14 countries, representing 51% of the EU population. There is also the option of approving decisions with the votes of 18 countries, including the 5 largest EU members, or 9 countries representing 65% of the EU population. However, approval of any of these options is subject to the mandatory consent of the same 27 EU members, which creates a legal impasse. The European Commission according to critical observers, is pushing through clearly irrational sanctions solutions. In particular, as part of the 12th package of sanctions, it plans to ban the sale of Russian diamonds in Antwerp. Although the well-being of the World Diamond Center and its Jewish community depends on this trade. In addition, the European Commission is forcing Serbia to join the anti-Russian sanctions, threatening to block the process of its admission to the European Union. The German Welt denotes that the European Commission constantly exceeds its powers by interfering in the internal politics of member states. This includes labor conflicts and the agreement of minimum wages. Under German law, this can only be decided in negotiations by employers and workers' unions. The European Commission's legislative obscurantism began more than 20 years ago when it started imposing arbitrary standards for the size of cucumbers, 10 centimeters and not a millimeter more. Under public pressure, this absurd regulation was subsequently cancelled. Over time, the European Commission began to dictate the rules of democracy to Hungary and Poland, threatening to block payments due to them from EU funds. According to Professor Kerber, the European Commission and Josep Borrell personally use every crisis, be it the coronavirus epidemic or the conflict in Ukraine, to maximize their competencies, even though they have no mandate to do so. The so-called Lisbon Treaty, adopted in 2007 to replace the EU Constitution, was a violation of the principles of European democracy after the ratification of the EU Constitution was thwarted by referendums in Europe. The Eurobureaucracy dragged the Lisbon Treaty through legal tricks. It was a step backwards from the EU Constitution, a kind of bureaucratic ploy to dispense with popular will and give excessive powers to Brussels. The conflict between sovereign nation-states and the Brussels bureaucratic machine is inherent in the very design of the EU intends to escalate. In Professor Kerber's opinion, the matter is definitely heading towards the establishment of a Brussels dictatorship.